If you were in gaming spaces on the internet in 2016, especially on YouTube, you'll probably remember the indie horror boom that we saw the genre experience in that time period. This can mostly be accredited to the overnight success of an immediate franchise spawned by Five Nights at Freddy's, which caused a slew of indie developers to come out in hopes of replicating FNAF's explosion in popularity. Some of these were in good faith, created by indie developers who were inspired by Scott Cawthon's story and thought that if he could make it big, then so could they. On the other hand, there were also the bad faith actors who saw FNAF's franchise explosion and thought of it as a get-rich-quick scheme. One such game that appeared on the market in this era was Bendy and the Ink Machine, developed by indie creators The Meatly and Mike Mood. On February 10th, 2017, the first chapter of the game came out, and fans were quickly taken with the aesthetic and concept of the game. While the first chapter was a fairly simple proof of concept, the game showed potential, and people began latching onto the game and anticipating the upcoming chapters. For those unfamiliar, Bendy is a horror title inspired by the aesthetics of old 1930s Disney or Fleischer cartoons, in which the corrupt boss of a fallen animation studio, Joey Drew, invites his former business partner, Henry, to their old studio to apparently show him something. Where have I seen this before? Henry arrives at the studio and ends up falling into its depths, encountering living, physical versions of the cartoon characters from the studio's heyday, seemingly brought to life by the Ink Machine, whose ink is somehow cursed and attempts to consume everything. So, did Bendy live up to its potential? Well, in my opinion, not really. There are individual pieces here that could make for a compelling narrative and world, but the developers didn't capitalize upon them, so what we got ends up being a project that perpetually feels like it's going somewhere but then ends up just kinda not. It's like an airplane ride that taxis around the runway for a little and then starts to speed up like you're gonna take off, and then the pilot's like, "We've reached our destination," and you're like, "But we never went in the air," and then the pilot tries to sell you merch of how awesome this plane ride was. Okay, I've spent enough time with this plane analogy. Let's stop pussyfooting around and get to the point. Also, just gonna throw this in here, I'm not gonna talk about any of the controversy with Kindly Beast as a company. While I definitely have thoughts on the whole ordeal, this video is not the venue to share them. If you want more information about that, there's an amazing video by Chris Portal that goes through the entire situation in comprehensive detail that I will link to in the iCard. But without further ado, let's start with Chapter 1, Moving Pictures.
Alright, Joey. I'm here. Let's see if we can find what you wanted me to see.
It's not exactly a revolutionary take to say that Bendy Chapter 1 is pretty uneventful, and I'm not gonna knock it super hard for that. It's basically a proof of concept, and that's fine as long as you're not gonna try to market that as an entire game's worth of content. But just because it was made early in the game's life cycle doesn't mean that it's exempt from criticism, especially when it's been overhauled multiple times. I'm sorry, but this chapter really is just an absolute snooze fest. We wander around the studio a little, find some meaningless items, then fall down a hole, and that's the end. Having this chapter just be like a time for world building before leading to the inciting incident would be fine, but they go about it in the most boring way possible. The Ink Machine's reveal seems to push the game towards a more suspenseful atmosphere, but then it just doesn't really go anywhere. This applies to the other super spooky stuff here, like the dead Boris and the altar. The game just lays out all its cards on the table and is like, okay there, be scared now. Speaking of which, the occult stuff in this chapter is way too on the nose for Chapter 1, especially considering the contents of the next chapter. Well, I guess I shouldn't say Chapter 1, but the area in which Chapter 1 takes place. This is the top floor, the supposedly normal area that most people will see. And there's just a cut-open dead body right there for anyone to see. I get why it's here in terms of the game design, it's to intrigue people, but I feel like if they had to include this, then they should have had it be a little more well hidden. While the altar room is less egregious, it's also pretty dumb to have it just sitting there. Alright, let's talk about the main quest of this chapter, which is to find some random things. The only object besides maybe the book is completely irrelevant and meaningless. Why do we need these things to turn on the machine? Because the game has to have gameplay, but even calling it gameplay is a little generous of me because there's nothing to do besides getting the items. There's not enemies to avoid or puzzles to solve, you just pick them up and that's it. And since there's so little to say about the gameplay because there's barely any of substance, let's cut to the chase, literally. After collecting all the items, you go to check out the machine and then suddenly evil Bendy pops up and knocks you back. The studio begins to flood with ink and as you run to the exit, the floor falls from beneath you and you fall into the abyss. You walk into what appears to be a ritual room with a pentagram drawn on the floor, and as you step into it, the screen begins to shudder violently, and we see three flashes: the ink machine, a wheelchair, and Bendy. These visions mean absolutely nothing. Henry blacks out as the chapter ends. Okay, so what happened in this chapter? Well, we collected some pointless items, we got jump scared by Bendy, and then we begin our main quest of the game, to escape the studio. Since this is just chapter 1, I don't want to be too harsh, but there is just so much nothing in this chapter. You just meander around the studio for a little bit, and then suddenly there's an incredibly out-of-place and sudden chase, and then the actual story starts. If we just cut the stupid fetch quest and had us turn the machine on and fall down immediately, nothing would have been lost. As for these visions at the end, back when only the first couple chapters were out, MatPat came out with a game theory which I highly suspect was the original intention. The interpretation states that Joey was infected with polio, and in a last-ditch effort to save his life, used the machine to turn himself into Bendy. Editor's note, after this more recent game theory video, I'm almost 100% certain that this is the case. It makes sense, but when the game was fully realized, there was nothing to indicate what these flashes meant. This is the first time we'll see this theme of things being brought up and never going anywhere, and it sure won't be the last. Alright, on to Chapter 2, The Old Song, one of the better chapters. The chapter begins with Henry waking up and picking up the nearby axe, smashing his way through the boards to get to the next area. You trek forward and see Sammy Lawrence walk by, who disappears when you see the end of the hall he was walking down. You then have to flip some switches to open a door, making you backtrack through this puddle of ink to flip them because you couldn't before. Brilliant game design right there. Also, Henry has this line to direct you to the switches, which is so unnecessarily long and makes it insultingly obvious, and it's really funny to listen to.
Need to get power to this gate somehow. Should be a couple switches nearby. Then maybe I can open it.
Letting players figure things out on their own? Who's she? Actually, I might have spoken too soon because the subtle direction in this next part is actually fairly well done. Sammy's ink pump log is pretty well performed and provides some good characterization for him, and Norman Polk's is also good. The ones with the instruments and the keys are a little on the nose, but I can let it go. But am I to believe Wally just never found his keys and they were just lost to the trash forever? After this, you get your first taste of combat in this game, which is really bad. I get it's not a combat-centric game, but the fighting mechanics are just super clunky. Henry moves and attacks so slowly, so there's basically no strategy besides run back, try to get in a couple hits, and then run back again. It's so awkward, especially when there's a ton of parts where there's just massive waves at a time, and you're stuck in this tiresome cycle of left-click, S, W, left-click. Anyway, you can then open Sammy's Sanctuary and get another onslaught of searchers. After that, you have to solve a puzzle with the searcher wearing a funny hat, and then you can finally leave. So you think, but then Sammy attacks you and Henry blacks out. You then awaken as Sammy is tying you up, preparing you as a human sacrifice to appease Bendy. Sammy begins an unhinged ramble about his obsession with Bendy and summons him to claim his offering. However, the ritual goes wrong and Bendy seemingly kills Sammy instead. Once again, I will say that the voice work here is really good. The actor did a really good job of characterizing him as flamboyant and conceited, and I think a lot of the credit for him being such a fan favorite goes to the excellent performance. In the midst of the chaos, Henry manages to escape his bonds and you pick up your conveniently placed axe to break the boards down the hall. The music slows to a crawl as you get to the end, but suddenly Bendy comes out of the ink and begins to chase you. After some more hallways, you finally seem to reach safety, when a bacon soup can rolls around the corner, and...
Hello? Someone there? I know you're in here. Come out and show yourself. Boris?
And scene for Chapter 2. Alright, let's see what we could cut without it being confusing. And like the last chapter, the answer is most of it. If the chapter began with Henry listening to Sammy's audio log and then being immediately captured, nothing would be lost or confusing. Hell, the chapter could even just start with Henry waking up with Sammy tying him up and it wouldn't be that confusing. None of your actions in this chapter help progress the plot at all, and that would be fine if this is a chapter for more world building, but there isn't enough to constitute a whole 20% of the game. Bendy has a cult of worshippers is an idea we see all across the game and not something that requires this much content devoted to this one motif when nothing comes of it. But anyway, let's move on to Chapter 3, Rise and Fall. The chapter opens with Henry hanging out with Boris in their shelter, about to set off to explore a new area. You hit the road, and I will say that I'm so glad they didn't make you have to stay right next to Boris the whole time for him to move, because that would make this chapter just more unbearable than it is already. After going through a toy factory area and solving a couple puzzles, you get to meet... Okay, Alice Angel. I have some split opinions on her. For context, here's her backstory. Susie Campbell, Alice's voice actor, became very attached to her role as Alice, and also seemed to have a vaguely romantic relationship with Joey Drew. However, the voice of Alice was then changed to Allison Pendle, and Susie became incredibly distraught over this. Her sadness turned to spite as she grew an increasingly resentful attitude towards Joey Drew, who was apparently gossiping about her behind closed doors. He then offered her an opportunity, seemingly being turned into the Alice Angel we see in the game via the ink machine. On one hand, I think she definitely has the potential to be an interesting character. If you've seen my 4th Closet video, you'll know I adore Elizabeth in that book, and Alice would seemingly be the same here. However, I find the way she's portrayed to be mired in a lot of misogyny. She just falls too much into the crazy woman trope for my liking, not to mention her obsession with her looks, her jealousy of another woman and desire for a man's validation being primary characteristics of hers, and the fact that she, probably the most important female character in the game, is implied to have had an inappropriate relationship with her boss. It's also really funny when you look at this AMA where someone asked if there were any queer people at the studio and Mike Booth says, our characters are defined by their actions, not their identities. Like, one of the main antagonists of your game is just evil woman, and she would not work as a villain were she not a woman. But I've gotten way off topic, let's get back to the actual game. After encountering Alice, you are then given the option to take the angel path or the demon path. This decision changes absolutely nothing. The only thing it changes is the post-credit picture after the chapter ends and the potential to get the Tommy gun, which is also ultimately irrelevant, but we'll get there. You then get to fight the Butcher Gang for the first time, which is a perfect example of ideas and motifs going nowhere, which occurs quite a bit in this game. The Butcher Gang's designs are made in a much more unique way than the rest of the characters. While everyone else is either a cartoon or just a generic ink creature, the Butcher Gang members are grotesquely mutilated with inanimate objects fashioned on for limbs. While this could be written off as just a cool looking design, when you look at the Fisher, he has a sign reading "Liar" branded across his stomach. This is not an innocuous design choice. In stories, things have meanings, and you can't brand yourself as being a smart game with mysteries that can be solved, while also including very specific details like this because it looks cool, and never giving it a resolution or even a hint towards one in the story. Alice invites Henry to meet her, and when you get to level 9, you enter her chamber, full of gutted Borises and Butcher Gang members. She then goes on a whole spiel regarding her obsession with perfection and how she was born from the ink machine. Now feels like a relevant time to mention that Alice has this thing where her voice will occasionally increase in pitch, sounding more similar to Susie, most notably here.
I had to do it. She made me.
Why does this happen? Who knows, because this detail is never brought up again. Again, just meaningless noise, ideas with no substance behind them. After listening to Alice's ramble, you then begin the main section of the chapter and oh my god, is it boring. Alice basically sends Henry to do her grocery shopping and run her errands for her. You have to do 4 whole fetch quests, all of which consist of basically the exact same thing. Run up and down the same 4 floors to get Alice the allotted amount of item X she wants and return them to her so she can give you some more random garbage to find. It is so goddamn tedious. Sometimes you'll have to fight some generic enemy, and sometimes Bendy will show up and wander around a bit, and you have to hide in the little miracle station to avoid him, which is the only level of complex gameplay you'll get, so hope you enjoy it. Even worse, for her 5th task, Alice asks you to defeat a horde of Butcher Gang members, which means even more time with the slow and clunky combat. Yay! Look, I could excuse the poor combat if it was just beating back a couple enemies every now and again, but there are so many parts of this game in which they just throw waves of enemies at you. This isn't a hack and slash game. Fighting enemies directly shouldn't be a super common occurrence, and definitely not a mandatory main quest. After defeating the Butcher Gang, Alice gives you your final quest, for which she gives you the Tommy gun. However, if you try to pick it up, it dissolves into ink. But there is a way to get the Tommy gun, via a convoluted process of playing with this ink toy, choosing the demon path, and not dying throughout the chapter. What indicates that these choices will grant you access to the Tommy gun? As far as I know, nothing. More arbitrary stuff that's there because why not? You then have an encounter with the Projectionist, who I will say has a fantastic design. If you acquire the Tommy gun, you can actually defeat the Projectionist, but this becomes irrelevant later. After acquiring the last of Alice's groceries, she then frees you from her horrible fetch quest prison, allowing you to finally leave. Psych. Alice actually sends the elevator crashing down below the studio so she can steal Henry's perfect Boris, rendering all of our actions absolutely useless. The chapter ends with Alice kidnapping Boris as he futilely attempts to resuscitate Henry. So what did we accomplish this chapter? Well, we wandered around, found a woman, did her grocery shopping, and then fell down an elevator. Again, nothing you do in this chapter affects the story. If Alice just dropped Henry down the lift the second time he stepped in, nothing would be lost or confusing. The quests are tiresome and tedious and are just there as a courtesy because a game has to be game length if you're going to charge people for it. It's like they heard the criticisms of the previous chapters being too short, which I find frankly irrelevant, and were like, okay, we just need more stuff, and added a bunch of content TM. This content TM doesn't really give us character development, characterization, world building, or engaging gameplay. Sometimes less is more, and adding repetitive padding for the sake of having a thing be there will probably bore people, and if people get bored with an episodic style game, well, you're gonna have a bit of an issue. Enough about Chapter 3 though. The reason I spent so much time with it is because it's where a lot of my aforementioned issues really boil to the surface, and while I could give them a pass in the first couple chapters, we're on Chapter 3 of 5 and these problems have not been resolved. Let's move on to Chapter 4, Colossal Wonders. Chapter 4 throws you right in, immediately giving you the objective to rescue Boris. You solve some very straightforward puzzles, but in the library, there's a part where suddenly everything goes crazy, and the lighting is blown out and the lamp starts swinging. Then it just stops. I'll get to this in a little bit. After this, you have to solve a simple puzzle where you use this ink synthesizer machine to create a gear to fix the machine attached to the lift that will take you across the chasm. While you move across the ravine, there's a part where the cord seems to begin to snap, and the ambience begins to get really intense as you think you're gonna fall, and then it just reaches the other side perfectly fine. Why? What was the point? This game is so weird, oh my god. After this, you walk down a hall when there's another hallucination moment thing where everything goes crazy, and there's a bunch of hands grabbing at you, and then that's the last time this ever happens in the game. This never occurs again throughout the entire game, and I just... Why? Why? You can't just put things into the game on a whim because you feel like it. In a game that markets itself on the way that Bendy does, things have to be there for a reason. Alice then taunts Henry as he climbs a massive stairwell. When you reach the top, you see a sad lost one, before seeing this.
He always finds me. Oh
I actually really like this room. The atmosphere is perfect and it really does make you feel for the lost ones. The lost ones huddling together, looking for some kind of comfort and looking dejectedly at Henry really drives home how much the ink machine destroyed, and how many lives it took. I wish the game placed more emphasis on things like this instead of cheap fetch quest bullshit. Anyway, after this you crawl through a vent, Bendy pops up to look creepy, and then you get to the main area of the chapter, Bendyland. I was super hyped when I saw this because Evil Theme Park is such a rich setting, and I will say Bendyland does not disappoint. Your main objective of this chapter is to open the haunted house to get to Boris, and to do so you have to complete a variety of tasks. First, you have to play some carnival games to open a gate to an area where you have to use a soup can to distract these enemies, which is how enemy encounters in this game should work. In this room, you see a Bendy animatronic, which wouldn't be a big deal if there wasn't a whole ass tape about it from Lacey Benton. Because guess how many more times the Bendy animatronic comes up? Never again. Why put it here and place so much emphasis on it if you're not going to do anything with it? Actually, I know why. Because FNAF is the current popular thing since Pizzeria Simulator just came out and people are excited about it again. After this, you get to fight the first mini-boss of the chapter, Bertram Piedmont. This is actually a pretty good battle. In order to defeat this boss, you have to wait for the carousel to slam its arms down and then rush in to destroy the joints. While the attacks are fairly easy to avoid, having to rush in to quickly break the arms is effectively tense, since you don't really know when the arms are going to swing back up. You can also decide if you want to be more risky and try to get a lot in one round, or play it safe and just get a couple in. And there isn't any of this awful melee combat. Overall, Bertram Piedmont's boss battle is a pretty good one for the first actual battle in the game on Chapter 4 of 5. Finally, you get to the last area required to open the haunted house, this area with the train. And guess who's back? It's the projectionist. And you might be asking, hey, is he back even if you killed him before? And the answer to that is yes. What? Why? Why did they even give you the option to kill him? Oh my god, I'm losing my mind with this thing. This bitch is tiring. Add that to the list of things that don't matter at all, which is quite long at this point. Anyway, you get the breaker down here, but as you're leaving, the projectionist will notice you no matter what, forcing you to hide in the little miracle station. The projectionist creeps towards you, poised to attack when suddenly... Why did that happen? Well, dear viewer, you will go to your grave wondering that, because there is never an explanation given for this. What can I even say that I haven't said 100 times already? After this pointless scene, you can finally enter the haunted house, and I will say that the environment here is perfect, as it is with most of the game, to be fair. It really does replicate the atmosphere of the Disneyland Haunted Mansion perfectly. As you reach the end of the ride, however, you see what's become of Boris. You were too late. Alice has already not only gutted Boris for his perfect ink, she's also turned him into her ruthless puppet. It's time for the second boss of the chapter, Brute Boris. Again, Brute Boris actually has a pretty good boss battle. The way it works is that you have to get Boris to charge into the wall, and when he disorients himself, you have to pick up the thick ink that he bleeds and use it in the ink synthesis machine thing from the lift puzzle near the beginning of the chapter to make a weapon to attack him with. Hey look, setup and payoff. That's a first from this game. Anyway, repeat this a few times and the battle is over as you sadly watch Boris dissolve into ink. I don't think this one is quite as good as Bertram Piedmont, but definitely not a bad battle by any means. After defeating Boris, Alice becomes absolutely enraged and flies out of the tunnel to finish the job herself, when suddenly she's stopped by... Alice? Hey, wait, where have I seen this before? No, I'm just kidding. Chapter 4 predates the fourth closet. Anyway, the chapter closes with Alice and Boris dead, but their body doubles also alive. So what was accomplished that Henry had agency over this chapter? I'll give you 5 seconds to guess. Okay, time's up. The answer's nothing. Not only does Boris not survive, making this whole journey fruitless, we don't even dispose of Alice ourselves, which would at least be something. If Allison and Tom had killed Alice off screen at the beginning, then nothing would have changed about the ending. Henry could have just sat around twiddling his thumbs the whole time, and it wouldn't matter because Alice would have killed Boris already, and Allison and Tom would have killed her, regardless of what you did. And while I will credit the gameplay for being more than just a walking around and pressing E occasionally simulator this time, really the theme park stuff is just filler, because again, games have to be game length. And it'd be fine if we actually got some new plot threads that went somewhere here, but the only idea here that's actually resolved fully is Bertram's character. The animatronic thing doesn't come up again, and neither does Bendy killing the projectionist, so we could easily just cut those portions out and have the only thing necessary to open the haunted house be the Bertram boss battle, and nothing would be lost. Alright, we're in the home stretch now. We have reached Chapter 5, The Last Reel, aka the holy grail of things being added on a whim with no resolution. We open with Henry waking up imprisoned in a cell in Alice and Tom's home. Henry and Alice have a conversation about the weird ongoings of the studio. Then there's a scene of Alice leaving Tom by himself in the home to watch Henry while she explores, as he ominously threatens Henry with an axe. After this, Alice offers Henry some food, and then Tom does this. Look, I get wanting to characterize Tom as untrusting, but it's one thing to be cold and another to be mean, and this is just excessive. Alice then gives Henry the seeing tool, which lets you see secret messages on the wall and can be used in previous chapters. Flash forward again, and Tom has apparently done something to incur Bendy's wrath, and he's now coming to attack them. Alice makes a really pathetic effort to free Henry before Tom advises her to give up, and they just abandon you there. You then use the seeing tool to escape the prison, and by the way, the seeing tool is never utilized for a puzzle again, and reach a river of ink, upon which you have to pilot a boat. While you're piloting the boat, a massive hand will sometimes emerge from the depths to jam the rudder and slow your progress. Who does this hand belong to? Who knows? Also, the novelty of this section wears off very quickly. After a while, it just gets so tedious and loses any of the tense atmosphere it ever had. After this, you reach the end of the journey and arrive at a city of lost ones. When you get to this door, you suddenly come face to face with...
Abandoned. I trusted you. I gave you everything.
Why? Why is Sammy back? What kind of indication was there that Sammy would, 1, be potentially revived, or 2, be given the means to be revived? We learned from Alice that if Bendy touches you, then you get pulled into the darkness, so why is he able to come back just fine, like, a few days later? You can't establish rules for your world and then not enforce them. As far as I'm concerned, the only reason Sammy came back here is because he's a fan-favorite character. After bopping him around a little, Sammy then prepares to kill Henry when suddenly he's saved by Tom, who's apparently on good terms with him now. Okay, 2 things. First of all, bringing Sammy back to life to kill him immediately is just brilliant. That really added a lot to his character. Second, what happened to cause this change of heart with Tom when the last time Henry saw him he was leaving Henry for dead, and before that being actively cruel to him by depriving him of food? But we don't have time to talk about this because time for another stupid waves of enemies fighting section. I already talked about my frustration with this, so I'm not going to complain about that again, but I will complain about something else. Is it just me, or does this section feel backwards? Sammy, the established character, gets like a 2-minute battle, and then we get this whole long thing with all these random enemies. Which makes me also ask why Sammy was given such a basic battle. Chapter 4 showed that the developers are capable of making complex and enjoyable battles that don't just consist of hitting something repeatedly. Then Sammy, one of the fandom's favorite characters, gets brought back for this immensely unceremonious battle in Second Death. Also, why do we have to fight the Lost Ones here? The last time we encountered the Lost Ones, they seemed fairly indifferent towards Henry's presence in the studio, just staring at him sadly. Why are they attacking him now? If it has something to do with Alice and Tom's presence, what's their beef with them? What is the point of anything? After this, Alice tells Henry to lead the way forward, which doesn't really make sense since Henry's done nothing to prove to her that he's a skilled navigator, and then my point is proven immediately because the first thing Henry does as party leader is fall down a hole. And the part after this is unbearable. It's the worst parts of Chapter 3 combined into one awful maze that's easily a good quarter of the chapter. You have to get all the way to Joey's office at the end to get the extra thinking, and then go all the way back to use the ink synthesizer thing to make pipes to drain this room. And you have to do this 3 times! Mercifully, you keep the ink if you die, but by extension that makes the optimal strategy to let yourself die with it so you don't have to go all the way back. And if people are dying on purpose to avoid playing your game, perhaps that's an indication that you haven't made something very compelling. After this, Alice and Tom reunite with you, and then Henry is like, we need to kill Bendy, and like, what? Why do you care about this so suddenly? Henry's goal this chapter is so unclear. Like, in 2 and 3 his objective is to leave, and then in 4 it abruptly becomes to save Forrest, and now it just seems to be to follow Alice and Tom around. What has he learned in this chapter that would make him think that defeating Bendy will save everyone? Also, since when does he care about saving everyone? Alice then has this cute line about how she's gonna need a bunch of things to open the door before Tom just punches it and it works, which I like, but also addressing the fact that there is a problem and then doing nothing to resolve it helps nobody. Lampshading major criticisms like this isn't going to do anything if you're not going to try to actually fix it. After going through a few hallways, you find an area that looks like the beginning of the game, and Henry says the same thing that he says at the beginning of the game. Why is this here? Like, if you know the ending, you'll have a vague idea of what it means, but it still doesn't really make sense, because the idea of other iterations of the loop leaking into the current one never really comes up. Henry has no reason to see this here, as opposed to the beginning of the game as normal. Finally, you reach the ink machine, and it's time for the final encounter with Bendy. Alice and Tom send Henry into the machine, and they're just like, okay, bye. Now feels like a good time to ask why Alice and Tom are even here. At every chance the game gets, it splits them from Henry, and the little time we do get with them doesn't inform our understanding of them, or Henry, or the world. There's barely anything that would need changing to make sense if they were cut out of the picture entirely, and honestly I think cutting Alice and Tom entirely would actually improve the game. Let Henry fight Alice himself, so 1, he can actually do something to affect the narrative progression, and 2, Alice's death would feel much less mean-spirited. Anyway, let's talk about the final showdown. For the final battle, Bendy transforms into this massive, monstrous monkey version of himself, which honestly just looks goofy to me. Also, this version of Bendy feels substantially less threatening than the one we saw before. Bendy showed some level of intelligence before, and retained some characteristics of his cartoon counterpart, which gave him a certain level of threateningness, but I'm not that afraid of this big dumb dog that can only run along a couple of set paths. I feel especially less intimidated when he starts breaking his own pipes. This feels goofy to me, like a silly mini-boss that hurts himself with his own attack. Think Master Koga from Breath of the Wild. Put a different soundtrack over this and it could easily feel that way. After this immensely embarrassing final boss battle, we finally access the means to defeat Bendy. The end. I actually don't hate this or think it's cheesy like a lot of people seem to. I think it ties in well with the motif of the game and the missing ending of the Tombstone Picnic cartoon. You then cut to an entirely different setting with an entirely different aesthetic, Joey Drew's apartment. Again, I will say the aesthetics are on point. They do a great job of differentiating the two environments. We then get a chance to talk to him, and we hear the following.
Henry! So soon? I didn't expect you for another hour yet. Now you're just trying to impress me. But I know. You have questions. You always do. The only important question is this. Who are we, Henry? I thought I knew who I was. But the success starved me. Nothing left but lines on a page. In the end, we followed 2 different roads of our own making. You, a lovely family. Me, a crooked empire. And my road burned. I let our creations become my life. The truth is, you were always so good at pushing, old friend. Pushing me to do the right thing. You should have pushed a little harder. Henry, come visit the old workshop. There's something I need to show you.
All right, Joey. I'm here.
And that's the end of the game. As we're treated to this honestly amazing closing credits sequence, I'm left wondering, what was the point of any of this? Look, this ending is just the epitome of all of my issues with this game so far, and the Meatly's lack of use of Chekhov's gun. For those who don't know, Chekhov's gun is a principle created by Anton Chekhov, a Russian playwright, which states that every element introduced into a story must be plot relevant somehow. And this is a principle with which I absolutely agree. While maybe not everything has to be plot relevant, most of the things you put on the screen should be. You can't just add things into a story on a whim, especially with a more mysterious title like Bendy, which seems to market itself on its ability for its lore to be solved. While this cycle idea is cool in concept, it doesn't really go anywhere, at least not to our knowledge. There's not another ending you can get that breaks the cycle. Well, there's this thing, but it doesn't really seem to indicate that it breaks the loop in any way. And it just leaves me wondering, why did I play this? During Bendy's heyday, I was a big fan of it, and after finishing Chapter 5, it left me with an empty feeling. I felt unrewarded as an audience member, all of the theorizing and storytelling that the fandom was coming up with, all for it to amount to very little. And I'm looking back now and realizing that the ending itself isn't the issue. In a vacuum, the ending is pretty fine. But just given the context of the rest of the game having so much that goes absolutely nowhere, it kind of feels insulting to have it all just go back to square one. This ending is a microcosm of all of the issues I've mentioned up until now. For reference, let's compare this to FNAF, which seems to be one of Bendy's inspirations. As easy as it is to make fun of, FNAF's story is actually pretty tight. Each game progresses the flow of the narrative. There are very few points in the story of FNAF in which I feel like it sits around twiddling its thumbs and meandering around, which I can't say for Bendy. Like, take Sister Location for instance. Sister Location is a very narratively tight story. We learn more about the brother from FNAF 4 and about the missing sister from that game. This game also begins Michael's arc and gives us more context for the rest of the games. With our key players all established in Sister Location, we can move on to Pizzeria Simulator's fiery finale. Should've known Sister Location would find a way to leak in here. As for Bendy, well, I really can't say the same thing. Even at its strongest points, I don't think that the story is being progressed by my actions. Like I said, while Chapter 4 is my favorite and most of the fandom's favorite, there's not actually much that gets done in that chapter. Most of the time is still spent doing meaningless puzzles in the theme park and trying to get into the haunted house, so you're stuck in one setting for like a good 75% of the chapter. And some may argue that I can find the answers to these questions in supplementary material like the books or the upcoming sequel. But I shouldn't need that supplementary material to understand the content of this one 5-chapter game. Circling back to FNAF, let's use FNAF 1 as an example. While yes, the events of this game would be expanded upon in later entries, on its own, it's still a fine story. Children are murdered and stuffed in the animatronic suits, and now they're condemned to wander the halls forever. That story doesn't leave me with a ton of question marks over my head, except maybe who the killer is. But even then, taken on its own, there aren't enough variables in FNAF 1 to even begin to ask who the killer is, because there's only 2 real potential candidates. So with all this in mind, I think I can say with confidence that Bendy and the Ink Machine is a game where nothing happens and nothing matters. Hey guys, thanks a ton for watching. While this isn't my typical FNAF content, the Bendy and FNAF fandoms do tend to overlap, and also I'll take as many opportunities as I can to prove that FNAF isn't as easily replicable as many people seem to think. As I said, I was a pretty big Bendy fan back in its heyday, but looking back on it now, I realized that Kindly Beast got what they wanted, to sell merchandise to stupid little kids. But now that I'm older and wiser, I'll take the opportunity to prove that they aren't the hot shit that they think they are. And I think another aspect that influenced me being a fan of Bendy back in the day was the fandom. Bendy's fandom is genuinely so impressive. They've produced content with 10 times the amount of heart and effort that Kindly Beast puts into their own. They also take criticism with dignity and respect Bendy's adversaries. To me, this proves that they deserve far more than what Kindly Beast gave them. Again, if you want more information on the controversy with Kindly Beast itself, I'll link Chris Portal's video in the description below. It is a masterpiece. But with that out of the way, I think that's all I have to say for this video. If you watched this all the way through to the end, thank you so much. Your support means everything to me, and if you want to show up more, you could leave a like on this video, or a comment, or even subscribe. With all that said, fuck capitalism, and I love you all. Bye!